The Washington State Department of Transportation was well aware for years of the extremely dangerous road conditions along the treacherous stretch of Interstate 5 highway between Marysville and Smoky Point, Washington, causing many deaths and serious injuries, all caused by the frequent failures of the woefully inadequate cable barrier system separating oncoming traffic. The department was put on notice of this extremely dangerous condition repeatedly, yet the state did nothing and continued to rely on the existing cable barrier system. And to make matters worse, even after the state knew the barriers were inadequate and didn't prevent crossover accidents, they continued to expand the program rather than correct it. Without question, the state was negligent in its placement of these ineffective cable barriers and has subsequently determined they should, if not so be replaced, then definitely be reinforced with a concrete barrier. In this special investigation, the Insider Exclusive goes behind the headlines to expose how the state's negligence forever changed the lives of one of Washington's outstanding young, hardworking couples, Aubrey and Jason Knapp, who tragically will never be the same again. On an everyday Washington Monday, June 25, 2007, at approximately 12:47 p.m., Aubrey was traveling northbound in her 1986 Nissan Maxima at the then posted speed limit of 70 miles per hour on Interstate 5 in the state of Washington, when she was suddenly and unexpectedly slammed into by an out-of-control car going northbound and shooting straight through the weak cable barrier system that the Department of Transportation erected in a cost-saving measure designed to prevent crossover collisions. Except that, as in so many times in the past, the cable barrier system failed. Aubrey suffered catastrophic injuries as a result of the crash and had to be medevaced to Harborview Hospital, where she underwent immediate life-saving surgery. Today, the Insider Exclusive tells Aubrey's nightmare story, her brush with death, and the courageous struggle she's going through, trying to regain some of the vibrant life that was suddenly snatched from her and her husband, Jason, and how her lawyer, Fred Langer, partner at the law firm of Nelson, Langer and Ingle, has gotten some justice for both of them, earning him the highest respect from citizens and lawyers alike as one of the best plaintiff trial lawyers in the state of Washington and in the nation. He has seen many innocent and hardworking people suffer needless injury, and because of that, he's driven to help people who have been harmed by the negligent actions of others. His goal, not only to get justice for Aubrey and Jason, but to make sure that all Washington's highways and roads are much safer for every driver, because he never wants another innocent victim to go through the same pain and suffering which Aubrey unfortunately now lives day to day and wishing her life were better.
The way that the accident has changed me is enormous. It changes the way I sleep, the way I walk, the shoes that I wear, the things that I do on a daily basis, and dance with my dad at my wedding. And I would love to be able to dance with my husband at a wedding and at our anniversary. I would love to be able to dance again and be able to stand on my feet for that long.
Hi, I'm Steve Murphy, and this is the Insider Exclusive, live from Seattle, Washington at the law firm of Nelson, Langer and Ingle. It is my great pleasure to introduce Fred Langer to the show. Welcome to the show, Fred.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Tell us a little bit about what your firm does.
We're a firm that represents people who have sustained injuries, and most of them are generally catastrophic injuries or people who have had brain injuries. We also represent disabled people who have been had difficulty collecting benefits from insurance companies.
And these are generally people who couldn't afford lawyers by themselves. So oftentimes a lot of times you take cases on contingency, right?
That's almost all of them. Very few people can afford to take on big corporations and states, so they need the help of law firms to make that possible. Today we're going to talk about the Aubrey Knapp case, which is a catastrophic injury case. Tell us a little bit about it. Well, Aubrey was injured. She was just driving to go to a barbecue with her family. She was just driving on her way home in between jobs, and after work she was on her way home.
It's about 3 or 4 years ago, right?
Oh, it's about 4 years ago, and she was driving on I-5, a very, very strange section of I-5. We learned over a period of time that there had been 7 fatalities within a 5-mile stretch. And she was driving south, and somebody just lost control of their vehicle on the other side of the road. And they went through these cable barriers, which had failed so many times to protect people on the opposite ways of a highway. And this car literally just hit her at a closing speed between the two vehicles of 120 miles an hour.
The cable barriers you're talking about, which are kind of like dividers, if you will.
Yeah.
But they really don't work well, do they?
No, they're really flimsy. They're really flimsy.
It's a fence, kind of.
It tries to be a fence, is what it really tries to do. I mean, the state had a number of choices in the ways it could erect barriers to protect people in opposite ways, and it chose probably the cheapest way it could be done, and it simply didn't work well enough.
Now, what happened to Aubrey in this accident?
Well, what happened was, as I said, the closing speed was over 120 miles, and the impact on her on the two cars was so great that the lower bone in her leg, called the tibia, was driven literally through her foot, and it came out the base of the heel, and it literally just destroyed her leg.
When I was reading the report, it was kind of interesting because it was brought out in the report that she had airbags in her car.
Yes.
And airbags protected the upper torso of her body.
Right.
But the bottom portion of her body, where her foot was and her leg, because the oncoming car hit that and drove it up, that was what was severely injured, right?
That's really interesting that you bring that up, because the surgeon who worked on her said that, you know, if it weren't for the airbags, she would have been dead. And what they call a pilar injury, which is literally, if you could imagine a pylon being driven into the ground, her tibia literally was the pylon that drove through her foot. This is a relatively new injury for orthopedic surgeons to deal with, because before the event of airbags, all the people would be dead.
Right. Now, your law office prepared 2 outstanding video depositions of 2 doctors of hers. One of them is her medical doctor by the name of?
Dr. Stephen Minersky. He is an outstanding orthopedic surgeon at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, Washington.
And we are going to go right now to that deposition so he can explain exactly what happened to Aubrey and her leg.
The kind of injuries that, for example, would see in an IndyCar driver that would crash his car into the wall at 140 miles an hour, because essentially what happens is you go from a very high rate of speed and then to acutely stopping, and so something has to give and you decelerate very quickly, and something gives, and in her case the failures of her skeleton were really in her, from the tibia down. She has what we call a segmental fibular fracture, you can see, and that has a failure here by impacting on the lateral side or the outside of her leg, and then there's a tension failure on the inside of her tibia, and you can see sort of a wedge right here because it's basically broken. If you then go to her foot is essentially continuing to decelerate into the floor, and if you go to the next, you can see. So this is now, that's that earlier fracture, that's the lower fibular fracture, and you see where her heel is, basically her foot has imploded around her ankle, and this is her heel, which should really be under here. When you look at the side view now, this is now the side view of her tibia, the shin bone. You don't really see the upper fibular fracture, so it's right about this here area. But you can see where this is the end of the tibia, this is the talus, which is essentially the joints of the ankle. And this is driven, this articular surface here should articulate with here, the navicular. So basically it's what we call a trans-talo-navicular dislocation. And her navicular was broken, this bone, and then as this imploded through the bottom of her foot, her heel, which you can see here, went around her talus. So essentially everything got, like a pile driver, got driven through, and her foot went to the side. She had a significant neurologic deficit in her foot because of that. The nerves that supply your foot are coming around the side of the tibia here, so they get significantly stretched by this kind of injury. And all the things we can do from an anatomical standpoint is reestablish her anatomy as best we can. So that from top to bottom, this is a rod that's in there. You see that the tibia is straight, but you can see the fractures don't completely normally realign to the fibula. We put it all together and make it look like, oh yeah, it looks like it's pretty good. You know, there's a reduction of the talonavicular joint with the pins, and we've just put the heel back as best we can.
We also have a video deposition of Ted Becker, who is a human performance specialist. And let's have him explain in a video deposition exactly what Aubrey's problem is.
The conclusions that'll be made regarding how bad or how restricted the leg is. To explain her problem, she has both the inboard and outboard problem with her foot and ankle at the shaft of the tibia, but she also has the restriction in the dynamics up and down in her leg. So when she goes to load bear on her heel, or when she goes to push off with her toe, those dynamics are also lost. And those are important components in walking, because the heel, when it hits, is where the shock is absorbed. And when shock is not absorbed correctly, it then basically radiates up into your knee and then up into your hip. And then what happens when she goes to propel off of her foot, she doesn't have the power to push, and that results in her body basically swaying side to side when she starts to try to push off or load onto that leg.
Now we're going to introduce the transportation engineer, a specialist, an expert in the field, who can tell us exactly why these cable barriers fail. His name is Richard Cook, and let's bring him on right now. It is my great pleasure to introduce Richard Cook, who's a forensic engineer. Welcome to the show, Dick.
Thank you.
You worked on this case with Fred, and you know a lot about the Washington State Department of Transportation ineffective cable barrier system, don't you?
Yes, I do. I actually drive that road that's pertaining to this accident area maybe once to twice a week, 50 to 100 times a year.
Right.
And have studied the movement of the vehicles through the cable guardrail with their tracks since the first one that I'm aware of was a Mustang that crossed over through the cable barrier. I personally saw that accident, so I took kind of an interest in these accidents and the tracks left by the vehicles, and have driven and looked at it on basically a weekly basis since 1995.
There have been many crossover fatalities, haven't there, over the years?
Yes.
What's been the problem with the Washington State Department of Transportation in making changes to more effective barriers, and what would more effective barriers be?
I felt it was a stubbornness on the part of their engineering staff to evaluate the cross-median accidents and the way that the cables were not reacting to a vehicle as we would expect a cable guardrail or a jersey barrier or a cement barrier to react. And the tire tracks that basically penetrated and demonstrated that the vehicles were driving straight through the cables, under, over, through the cables, was not an effective manner for one to expect something that is installed on the roadway to make it safer. But they gave a false impression to the engineers that they were doing what it was designed to do, but it just didn't work.
I understand that they had their own tests, which really weren't based in reality, right?
They were not true world experience with what we saw. For instance, say you take a little Honda with a low nose going under the cable, and then you take an SUV that drives through the cable. They were going according to their own choice of standards, but it wasn't the real world. It wasn't the real world crashes that we saw.
Now, as a result of this case and others like it, has there been some changes in the cable barrier system? Yeah.
Yeah, happily the state of Washington finally got the message, and what is done is that the cable barriers in this area where there were so many fatalities has finally been replaced with concrete barriers. Those concrete barriers have proven effective across the nation as preventing these sorts of fatal accidents. So, you know, we're very happy that the lawsuits that we brought did make a great change in the safety of the motorists in the state of Washington.
Well, thank God it's finally being done, and I want to thank you for being on the show, and keep up your good work. Fred, what was your legal strategy to win this case? Because you won it, didn't you?
Yeah, we made a very good recovery for our client. And these cable barriers were a known commodity, and we had a lot of experience that we could draw from. For example, these cable barriers were so bad that while the state of Washington was putting them in, literally California, with its base of experience, was taking them out. Right. And what we did is we took a look at the premise as to why they were put in. The state of Washington did rely on some testing where, for example, the crashes that they used to determine that it was okay were crashes that took place at 61 miles an hour. Well, the speed limit was 75 miles per hour.
Yeah, they were not realistic tests.
No, they were not realistic tests at all. And all we really had to do was show the physics of how these tests happen. And the number of the crashes was so great that the evidence that we gathered from all the cases all pointed to the exact same conclusion. Right. Inappropriate selection, inappropriate design, poorly placed. Get rid of them, save some lives.
Wow, we have Aubrey with us today.
Yeah, we're very glad.
But before we bring her on, I just want our audience to see exactly what her life was like before the accident. It is my great pleasure to introduce Aubrey Knapp to the show. Welcome to the show, Aubrey.
Thank you.
Take us back to that day you went out to, I think we were going to go have a barbecue with your family, right? And all of a sudden you got hit by somebody flying right off the other side of the freeway.
Yeah, it was a Saturday afternoon. The sun was just coming out. I was heading home from work. I had stopped by the store, and then I was going to my parents'. Mm-hmm. I was coming up to 88th Street, and there was always a lot of traffic there, so I got over into the fast lane so that I wasn't backed up behind everybody. And I looked up, and I saw a flash of red, and it was, you just knew something bad was going to happen. So I braced myself, and I braked, and then I felt the impact.
What do you miss the most about things you can't do?
I miss playing with my brother and sister, running, exercising, being myself.
You had seen cases like this before, hadn't you, Fred?
Yeah, this unfortunately was not the first time I've seen a case like Aubrey's. And unfortunately, we saw a case or two afterwards.
Really? Until they've changed some of the cable barriers, right?
Finally, the state got it.
Yeah. What are some of the challenges you face today, Aubrey?
There's still a possibility of surgeries in my future. Mm-hmm. I never know what's going to happen.
All right. We have your husband here with us today, and so we're going to bring him on so you can talk as a couple about how this has changed your life. So let's bring Jason on right now. I'm very pleased to have with us today Aubrey's husband, Jason. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thank you.
How has life changed for you as a couple because of Aubrey's injuries?
It's changed in a lot of ways, actually. There was 3 or 4 years where she was in casts and surgeries and not working, obviously, for quite a while. Mm-hmm. And so the burden there was huge.
Yeah.
Also, all the medical bills coming in with only one of us working. And then just not being able to do the things we used to do, you know, walk down to the river. Just walking on uneven ground in the backyard is hard for her.
Well, I know this accident happened when you had just been married, what, 6 months? So it was very trying on both of you. And my hat's off to both of you for working together, because, you know, nobody expects these things.
Well,
You know?
in some ways it's kind of brought us a little closer together, but it was rough.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both for being on the program, because your case served as just one more reminder about why the state has to have safer highways, right?
Correct, yeah.
As a lawyer, Fred, you must take great pride in a case like this, because the case actually spawned changes in the safety of all Washington drivers, didn't it?
Yeah, first of all, I'm very grateful to my client, Aubrey, for trusting me with the case. And what we were able to do with that case, along with the others that we represented, was make lives safer for the state of Washington's motorists. Those cable barriers are gone, and people are safer now because of it.
I see this time and time again, that lawyers like yourself, trial lawyers, who risk it all the expenses were on you.
Yeah.
To take a case to court, to trial. In this case, you settled beforehand because you had a preponderance of evidence as to what the state of Washington should have been doing.
Right.
You make changes, and that benefits all of us.
Yeah, and the truth is that had we not been willing to take the risk, it would not have changed, because whether I like it or not, the cost of going forward to court is simply prohibitive for most people.
Yeah.
And we were willing to risk it because we believed in our client and we believed in our case.
Well, you did a great job, and I want to thank you very much for being on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.